All right, so yesterday we talked about what integers were and their opposites and finding integers and opposites on number lines. So today you are going to find and place rational numbers on a number line using what you know about integers. So using what we learned yesterday about how to find an integer on a number line and then how to find the opposite on a number line. So let me pull up my number lines here and then we can get started. So when we talk about a rational number, so a rational number is going to be a number that is the quotient of two integers. So I typically will represent a rational number as form, so I can have a over b, right? Because again, we talked about in topics 1 and 2 that this right here represents division. So a and b, or I can have negative a over b, where their quotient is not equal to 0. So when their quotients are not equal to 0, those are rational numbers. So to give you an example of what a rational number is, a rational number would be 1/2. 1/2 is a rational number. So is a decimal, because to get into a decimal, I have to divide a number by another number. So I'm dividing a smaller number by a larger number. This is a quotient. I can represent this as a quotient. So these two values are going to be rational numbers. So is -3, because I can write -3 over 1, and now I have a rational number. Okay, so if we take a look at page 150, I just kind of defined what a rational number is. We're going to go ahead and we're going to place those on a number line to where I want to be. The first two values that we're going to take a look at is we're going to take a look at -1.5, and I'm going to place that on my number line. And then I'm going to take a look at -4/3 and place that on a number line. So -1/2, this one's fairly easy because I already have it in fraction form. It's set. So I want to take a look at where my values are. So if we take a look at where my values are, I have to see how far apart each one of my values are. So here's my 0, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 until I get my annotation of the 1. So that means each one of these little values is going to be equal to 1/4. Well, I know that 1/2 is going to be equal to 2/4. So I need to find -1.5. So I'm going to go to my -1, and then I'm going to go over 2. So there's -1 and 1/4, -1 and 1/2. So I'm going to mark that with a dot. Make my dot nice and big. And then I'm going to label -1.5. So when I do this, I'm going to make sure that I label my number value that I drew. So this is going to be -1.5. Notice that when I have -1.5, it's actually past the -1 on the negative side, because as I move right to left on my number line, my values are getting smaller. As I move right to left, notice my values are decreasing. So 1.5 is actually going to go past the 1 and be almost to the 2. Now, what -4/3, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write that as a improper fraction. So when I write that as an improper fraction, or I'm sorry, as a mixed number, 3 goes into 4 one time with 1 left over. So now I'm looking for -1 and 1/3. Well, here was -1 and 1/2. Here's -1 and 1/4. They're pretty close together. So I'm actually going to draw my dot in between the 1/4 and the 1/2. And I'm going to label that as -4/3. So I'm going to leave my labeling as the original number. That way I'm showing that, yep, I did graph that number correctly. Okay, so let's see if I can make my numbers just a little bit smaller. And I may have to pause the video. Yep, so give me a second and I will make the numbers just a little bit smaller. And I also made it to where you can see the values a little bit easier. This will be a little bit easier to graph as we go. So go ahead and flip to your guided practice. And so it says number 1, so why are decimals rational numbers? And we already talked about this. A decimal is a rational number because I am going to be written as a fraction. So when I had negative 1.5, I can write that as negative 1.5. And we talked about that a rational number can be written as a quotient, so where it's a over b. Well, this is a fraction, this is a fraction, this is a fraction. Decimals can be written as fractions. These two are equivalent. So decimals are rational numbers because I can write them as a quotient. Okay. Number 2, why are integers rational numbers? Again, we already talked about this. When I have 3, I can simply write it over 1. And when I write 3 over 1, that is written, remember, as a quotient, right? So I have a value that I'm dividing by another value because I can put any counting number or negative number as over 1. I can write them as a quotient, so they are considered to be a rational number as well. Okay. So it says in another way on the previous page, why does the point plotted represent 1.5 instead of negative 2.5? Because we talked about this, when I have a number line that's going this way instead of a horizontal, and here I have 0, here I have negative 1, here I have negative 2, negative 1.5 is going to be right here, and it's going to be in between the negative 1/2 and the negative 2 because it's the halfway point between negative 1 and negative 2. If I had plotted it further away, it would have represented a different halfway point. Okay, so again, the big thing I really want for you guys to get as a takeaway is that rational numbers, so an integer, a decimal, and fractions are all rational numbers because they can all be written as a quotient. Okay. Alrighty, so let's go to where we're actually going to be able to find and plot the rational numbers. So we have a number line that looks pretty similar to my number line. It's set up slightly different. So yours is set up as 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. Our spacing is good. So it says write the number positioned at each point. So number 4, if the point at A, so I have to take a look at where A is. So A is going to be right here. So that's going to be point A. Let me go ahead and position point B. And then let me go ahead and position point C. So your number line looks pretty similar to my number line. So point A, if we take a look at it, point A is going to be, here's my 0. Again, first thing I need to do is establish what each one of these intervals stands for. So I'm going to count 1, 2, 3, 4. So I have 4/4 equals 1. So each one of these tick marks is a value of 1/4 is what each tick mark represents. Okay, so that makes it easy. So I just need to take a look and see. So I have 1, 2, that's 2/4. But again, I'm negative. So A is equal to negative 2/4, but we always want to write that in simplified form. So the simplified form of negative 2/4 is going to be negative 1/2. Or if I write that as a decimal, it would be negative 0.5. Okay, so that's going to be your value for A. So let's take a look at our value for B. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start from 0, and I'm going to count how many over I am. So if I start counting, looking at 0, I'm going to be 1, 2, 3, but I'm positive because I'm in my positive numbers. So B is going to be 3/4 or 0.75. Okay, and then point C is going to be, so I'm going to count, I'm at 1, 1 1/4, 1 1/2, 1 3/4. but because it's negative, it's going to be negative 1 3/4 or negative 1.75. So this is my point A, point B, and then point C. And then number 7 says plot a point P at negative 1 1/4 on the number line above. So when I go to plot point P at negative 1 1/4, so I first find negative 1 at my number line, and I don't go forwards because these are the values that are less than 0. It's greater than 1 or greater than negative 1, so it's going to go here. So it's going to be negative 1 1/4. So I'm going to plot and mark it as point P. Okay, so you guys are going to practice this on 8 through 13. You're going to either give me the fraction or decimal number represented there, or if you know them, go ahead and give me both. And then 14 and 15, you're going to plot and draw number lines. And then you're going to do your math practices and problem solving. When you guys are finished with that, I have an activity to help you guys get some skills practicing how to plot rational numbers on a number line. The big thing to remember that as I go right, the values increase. So as I'm moving right on my number line, the values are greater. So even as I'm going this way, my values are going to be greater. So not less than, greater than, sorry. My values are going to be greater. And this is going to be important when we take a look at the lesson that we're going to do next. Values are greater as I go right. But as I go left on a number line, we know that the values are going to be less than, or they're going to decrease. Okay, so keep that in mind as you guys are plotting today. And remember that if I have a negative, like negative 1 1/2, it's going to be past the negative 1 and in between the negative 1 and the negative 2. Happy graphing and plotting.